Have you ever woken up from a dream, drenched in sweat, your heart pounding as if you'd run miles, unable to shake the feeling that what you saw wasn't just a figment of your imagination? That was me, Alaric Thorne, a historical archivist who spends his days delving into forgotten legends and eerie tales. But none of the stories I've uncovered could prepare me for what I'm about to tell you. It started as an ordinary night, the kind where the line between sleep and wakefulness blurs. Yet, as my eyes closed, I was pulled into a world so vivid, so chilling, that even now I question whether it was just a dream. Imagine a train station, shrouded in fog so thick it swallowed the moonlight. The cold air clung to my skin, and the smell of rust and decay filled my nostrils. As I stood there, I felt an overwhelming stillness. No wind, no movement, only the eerie silence broken by the distant sound of a train whistle. But here's the thing, there was no train. My breath fogged up the icy air, and a gnawing sense of dread crept over me. I was not alone. Shadowy figures flickered at the edge of my vision, their outlines barely discernible through the mist. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. As I tried to make sense of my surroundings, the silence was shattered by a metallic screech, like the sound of rusted gears grinding together. It echoed across the platform, growing louder and more oppressive, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned my head, and there it was, a train emerging from the darkness, its headlights dim and flickering like dying candles. The train wasn't modern, it looked ancient, its exterior corroded and its windows shattered. No passengers were visible, only an unsettling emptiness that seemed to beckon me closer. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but soon they grew louder, overlapping and incoherent, each voice laced with desperation and sorrow. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was clear, pleading, warning, or maybe both. My chest tightened as I realized the whispers weren't coming from the train. They were all around me, echoing from the shadows that loomed closer. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but it felt too real. The coldness biting into my skin, the acrid metallic taste on my tongue, and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching my every move. Before I continue, I need you to understand that the stories I share here are not for the faint-hearted. They're for those brave enough to step into the unknown and face the darkness that lingers on the edge of reality. If you're ready to join me on this journey, hit the subscribe button and leave a like. Because what I experienced at that station was only the beginning, and the shadows I encountered may be closer to you than you think. It began like any other night, a quiet evening, the kind that lulls you into a false sense of security. But as soon as I drifted into sleep, I found myself standing in a place I didn't recognize, yet it felt disturbingly familiar. A train station stretched before me, cloaked in an oppressive fog that blurred the edges of reality. The architecture was old, crumbling under the weight of time. Rusted signs hung precariously from their posts, their faded letters spelling out names I couldn't decipher. The air was cold and damp, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of rust and mildew, and every breath I took felt like inhaling decay itself. The silence was suffocating, broken only by an unsettling sound, a slow, rhythmic drip of water echoing in the distance, as if the station itself was weeping. The ground beneath my feet was slick with something that felt like oil, yet when I looked down, there was nothing but cracked concrete veined with dark, unidentifiable stains. A flickering lantern hung from the ceiling, casting an eerie yellow light that danced across the walls, making the shadows writhe like living entities. It was then I realized I wasn't alone. The first sign of something wrong came in the form of movement, subtle at first, a fleeting blur in the corner of my eye. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there, only the impenetrable fog curling and twisting like a living thing. Then came the sound, faint footsteps, deliberate and heavy, echoing from somewhere deep within the station. My heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to stop just behind me. I turned, expecting to see someone, or something, but the platform was empty. Yet I felt it, a presence watching, unseen but undeniable, the air thick with its suffocating weight. A chilling déjà vu swept over me. The station felt like a fragment of a forgotten memory, a place I had never been but somehow knew. Every detail seemed deliberately placed to unnerve me. The warped wooden benches, the peeling paint that revealed sinister scratches beneath, and the endless rows of broken windows through which the fog seeped like ghostly fingers. Each step I took echoed unnaturally loud, as though the station itself amplified the sound to remind me of how alone I was. Or perhaps it was to warn me. Suddenly, A faint whistle pierced the silence, distant yet bone-chilling. It was the sound of a train approaching, but it didn't evoke the relief one might feel at the promise of escape. Instead, it brought dread, as if the train carried something far worse than the suffocating loneliness of the station. The ground beneath me began to tremble, and the shadows seemed to ripple in anticipation. I could feel the vibration in my bones, a rhythmic pulse that felt alive, resonating with something deep within me, something primal and afraid. Then I saw it. Emerging slowly from the fog was a massive, decrepit train, its headlights flickering weakly like dying embers. The engine groaned and hissed as though in pain, its metal shell corroded and scarred by time. The windows were cracked, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness inside. As the train came to a halt, its brakes screeched like tortured screams, sending a shiver down my spine. The doors opened with a mechanical groan, revealing an empty, shadowy interior that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. For a moment, I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the station itself had wrapped invisible chains around me, pulling me closer to the open door. The whispers began again, soft and indistinct, like the voices of lost souls carried on the wind. They weren't coming from the train. They surrounded me, filling my ears with their sorrowful, haunting tones. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their meaning. They were beckoning me, urging me to step aboard. The decision was no longer mine to make. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the train's dark, gaping maw. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became, overlapping until they formed a cacophony of despair. As I crossed the threshold, the air inside was colder than ice, burning my lungs with each breath. The door slammed shut behind me, sealing me inside the suffocating darkness. My heart thundered in my chest as I realized the platform was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of shadows. And that's when I knew I had stepped into something far beyond a dream. I was no longer in control. Something else was. The air inside the train was colder than anything I'd ever felt, each breath condensing into clouds that hung heavy and motionless. My eyes strained to adjust to the dim, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the low hum of the train's machinery, which sounded more alive than mechanical. I took a tentative step forward, and the sound of my shoes against the rusted metal floor echoed unnaturally, as though the walls of the train were listening, amplifying my every move. The first car was empty, or so it seemed. The rows of seats were lined with tattered fabric, torn and decayed as if untouched for decades. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Shadows shifted at the edge of my vision, darting between the seats in shapes too quick and vague to define. My pulse quickened as I realized the shadows weren't random. They were deliberate, circling me, watching. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, growing louder with each step I took. This time, the words were clearer, though still distorted, as if spoken underwater. "Don't stay or leave." I turned sharply, certain I had seen movement behind me, but there was nothing except the empty aisle stretching into the darkness. The whispers grew more insistent, layered with a sense of urgency and dread. I wanted to turn back, to leave the way I had come, but when I looked over my shoulder, the door was gone. The entrance I had stepped through moments ago had vanished, replaced by an endless corridor of shadowy train cars. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving forward. The only way out, it seemed, was through. As I ventured deeper into the train, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost tangible, pressing down on me like a lead weight. The seats weren't empty anymore. I froze as I saw them, figures seated in the shadows, unmoving, their faces obscured by darkness. My breath caught in my throat when I realized they weren't solid. These weren't people, they were silhouettes, faint outlines of human forms shimmering like heat waves. Their heads turned in unison as I passed, following my every move with hollow, eyeless stares. The whispers rose to a crescendo, their urgency now tinged with anger. Turn back, they repeated, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of despair. But there was nowhere to turn back to, no exit, no escape. The train car felt endless, stretching on for miles, each step forward pulling me deeper into its clutches. And then I saw it, a faint light ahead, spilling from a doorway slightly ajar. It was the first sign of something tangible, something real, and despite the overwhelming sense of dread, I felt drawn to it, as if it held answers to questions I didn't yet know I was asking. The whispers fell silent as I approached the door, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from behind it. My hand trembled as I reached out, the icy metal of the handle sending a jolt up my arm. Slowly, I pushed the door open, revealing a room bathed in a pale, sickly light. The walls were lined with cracked mirrors, each one reflecting distorted images of myself, versions that were twisted, broken, and wrong. In the center of the room stood a single chair, and sitting on it was me. I stared in horror as the figure in the chair lifted its head. It had my face, but its eyes were hollow voids, deep wells of blackness that seemed to pull the light out of the room. Its mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong on any human face. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a guttural echo that vibrated through the room. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as the mirrors around me began to crack, spiderwebbing outward until the glass shattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, the room was empty. The chair, the mirrors, the doppelganger, gone. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into my back as I stumbled out of the room. The train groaned, its walls seeming to close in around me, and I realized with dawning horror that I wasn't merely inside a train. I was inside something alive, something that had been waiting for me. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever, driving me forward as the shadows began to move, taking shape, following me. I ran, the floor beneath me shaking as the train roared to life, hurtling forward into the unknown. The shadows closed in, their forms stretching and contorting, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of screams and warnings. Somewhere ahead, another door loomed, faint light spilling from its edges. Whatever lay beyond it, I knew it was my only chance. But with each step closer, the whispers grew louder, more hostile, until one voice rose above the rest, clear and deafening. "You will never leave." The door loomed ahead, faint light spilling from its cracks like a warning beacon. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the whispers that had now grown into a chorus of screams. Each step I took felt heavier, as though the floor itself resisted my movement, pulling me back toward the suffocating shadows that writhed and stretched in pursuit. The train groaned around me, the metallic creaks and groans sounding disturbingly like a living thing in pain. The air had become impossibly cold, burning my lungs with each shallow breath, and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes pressed harder against my back. When I finally reached the door, my hand trembled as it hovered over the handle. It was icy to the touch, sending a shock through my arm that felt more like an electric jolt than a chill. The voices beyond the door were faint but unmistakable, low murmurs laced with despair and fury, as though a crowd of unseen souls were gathered waiting. Summoning what little courage I had left, I turned the handle and pushed the door open, bracing myself for what lay on the other side. The room I entered was vast, impossibly larger than the confines of the train should allow. The walls were lined with broken clocks, their hands spinning wildly in opposite directions, their ticking echoing like a heartbeat that was both alive and fractured. At the center of the room stood a single figure, a veiled woman draped in tattered black, her silhouette flickering like a mirage. In her hands, she held a rusted key, its jagged edges gleaming faintly in the dim light. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but no words came out. My throat felt constricted, as if an invisible hand was choking the sound from me. The woman raised her head, and though her face was obscured by the veil, I could feel her eyes piercing through me, two black voids that seemed to draw out my deepest fears. The room grew darker, the faint light retreating as the shadows closed in, pooling at the edges of the woman's gown like living tendrils. Suddenly, the clocks on the walls stopped, their hands freezing in place as the air became unnervingly still. A single sound broke the silence, a deep, resonant voice that didn't come from the woman, but from the walls, the floor, the very train itself. "You have been chosen," it said, each word reverberating through my bones. The veiled woman extended the key toward me, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she was offering me something far more dangerous than it appeared. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but my legs refused to move. The shadows surrounding her began to shift and twist, taking on grotesque, human-like forms. They whispered in unison, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of anguish and rage. "Take it, or join us," they chanted, their words dripping with malice. My hands trembled as I reached for the key, the cold metal biting into my palm the moment I touched it. The moment the key was in my grasp, everything changed. The room shuddered violently, the walls groaning as cracks spiderwebbed through the surfaces. The shadows surged forward, their forms coalescing into a massive, writhing mass that loomed over me. The veiled woman dissolved into the darkness, her outline fading like smoke in the wind. A blinding light erupted from the key, illuminating the room in stark, white brilliance that revealed the full horror of the shadows. They weren't just formless masses, they were faces. Twisted, screaming faces, each one frozen in an eternal expression of agony. The light from the key grew stronger, burning my hand, but I couldn't let go. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as the light tore through them, but their resistance was fierce. They clawed at the edges of the room, their desperate cries filling the air as the ground beneath me began to crumble. I felt myself falling, the room dissolving into a swirling vortex of light and darkness. My vision blurred, the sound of the train's metallic screeches growing deafening, and then, nothing. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw it, the rusted key, sitting on my nightstand, its jagged edges glinting in the faint light of dawn. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the cold metal sending a wave of dread through me. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive feeling of being watched hadn't. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, a figment of my imagination. But the key's presence was undeniable, and with it came the sinking realization that whatever I had encountered in that train was far from over. The morning after the dream, the key remained where I had seen it, on my nightstand, cold and rusted, its jagged edges glinting faintly in the pale light filtering through the window. At first, I refused to touch it. The mere sight of it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if it carried the weight of the train and the shadows that had haunted me. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, some lingering fragment of my subconscious clinging to the edges of reality. But as the hours passed, the key remained, its presence undeniable. Unable to ignore it any longer, I reached out with trembling fingers. The moment my skin touched the metal, a chill shot up my arm, and the whispers returned. Not loud, but faint, distant, like echoes carried on the wind. They were fragmented, disjointed, but their urgency was clear. "Find us!" My grip faltered, and I nearly dropped the key, but curiosity overpowered fear. Something about it felt significant, as though it was more than an object. It was a tether, a connection to whatever I had encountered in the dream. Driven by an unshakable compulsion, I began searching for answers. I started with the details of the station. The fog, the decayed benches, the eerie silence. Everything felt too specific, too vivid to be entirely imagined. I scoured the internet for any mention of abandoned train stations, lost passengers, or ghost trains. Hours turned into days, and just as I was beginning to lose hope, I stumbled upon it, Brackenridge Station. The image on the website sent a jolt of recognition through me. It was the same place, the crumbling architecture, the rusted lanterns, even the faint markings on the platform. The station had been decommissioned decades ago, its tracks left to rust and decay. But what truly froze my blood were the stories associated with it. Dozens of accounts spoke of strange occurrences, disappearing travelers, sightings of shadowy figures, and an old, ghostly train that appeared without warning. Some claimed to hear whispers, while others reported vivid dreams of the station, dreams that felt as real as mine. One report stood out. A man described encountering a veiled woman holding a rusted key, her presence heralding a series of nightmares that never stopped. His account ended abruptly, with no follow-up or explanation. My pulse quickened as I read on, every word feeling like a confirmation of my own experience. The veiled woman, the whispers, the oppressive shadows, it was all there, documented by someone else. Determined to dig deeper, I searched for news articles about the station. Buried in an old archive, I found a chilling headline: "Passengers Vanish Without a Trace at Brackenridge." The accompanying article detailed a series of unexplained disappearances spanning decades, all tied to the station. Families waiting for loved ones were left with unanswered questions, their only clues being abandoned luggage and tickets scattered across the platform. My stomach churned as I realized that some of the names listed matched those I had seen in the ledger during the dream. My unease deepened when I reached out to locals in the area. Most were hesitant to speak, their voices hushed, as if mentioning the station might summon whatever haunted it. But one elderly man, Elias, shared a story that sent shivers down my spine. He spoke of seeing the train himself as a boy, watching it pull into the station with no conductor and no passengers, only flickering lights and an overwhelming sense of dread. He warned me, his voice trembling, that station doesn't just call anyone. If you dreamed of it, it's because it wants you. His words refused to leave my mind. The station wanted me. The key on my nightstand seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as though it were alive, waiting for me to unlock something I couldn't yet comprehend. The connection between my dream and the station was undeniable, and the whispers grew louder each time I tried to ignore them. In the days that followed, I noticed other strange occurrences. The symbol I had seen in the ledger during the dream began to appear in unexpected places. Scratched into the condensation on my bathroom mirror, etched faintly into the wood of my desk, even burned into the pages of a book I had never opened before. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a mark, a reminder that my encounter with the station wasn't over. Terrified but unable to resist, I knew there was only one way to find answers. I had to go to Brackenridge Station. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but the whispers had grown too loud to ignore, their chorus filling my mind at all hours. Find us, come back, unlock the truth. I packed a bag, taking the key with me, its cold weight feeling heavier than it should. Whatever lay ahead, I was no longer sure if I was chasing answers or if something far darker was pulling me in. The journey to Brackenridge Station felt like walking into a storm, each mile closer adding a suffocating weight to the air around me. The landscape grew desolate, the sky an unbroken sheet of gray that seemed unnaturally heavy. By the time I reached the outskirts of the station, the world felt eerily still, as if holding its breath. The road ended in a tangle of overgrown tracks and rusted metal, leading to the looming silhouette of the station itself. Time had left its mark on the structure. Its roof sagged, its walls weathered and cracked, and its windows shattered like jagged teeth. Yet, despite its abandonment, the station seemed alive, its presence pulsing with an energy that sent shivers through me. As I stepped onto the platform, the air changed. It was colder here, unnaturally so, the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of metal and the distant rustle of leaves, though no wind stirred. The key in my pocket grew heavier with each step, its edges pressing into my leg like a reminder of the unseen forces that had drawn me here. I could feel the station watching me, its unseen eyes tracking my every move, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd made a grave mistake by coming. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as I crossed the platform, the sound distorted as if the station itself was amplifying it. The faint smell of rust and decay hung in the air, just as it had in my dream, and a creeping déjà vu clawed at the edges of my mind. Every detail was the same: the warped benches, the faded signs, and the faint glimmer of a shattered lantern swinging in the distance. But now, in the waking world, the atmosphere felt heavier, the darkness more tangible. As I approached the edge of the platform, I saw him, a figure standing in the shadows near an old ticket booth. His form was hunched, his back turned to me, and he seemed frozen like a statue. I hesitated, fear gripping my chest, but curiosity pushed me forward. "Hello!" I called out, my voice breaking the silence like a stone dropped into still water. The figure didn't move at first, but then slowly he turned. The man's face was gaunt, his skin pale and drawn tight over his bones, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made me shiver. He introduced himself as Elias, the man I had spoken to during my research. His voice was low, rough, and laced with unease. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his words a stark contrast to the whispers that had pulled me here. When I asked him why, he sighed deeply, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. Elias told me the station had always been wrong, even before it was abandoned. People disappeared here, drawn by the same whispers that had haunted me. He explained that the train I had dreamed of wasn't a train at all. It was a vessel, a gateway to something beyond human comprehension. "It doesn't call everyone," he said, his voice trembling. "Only those it knows will follow." He warned me of the shadows, the veiled woman, and the key I now carried. "They're not ghosts," he said. "They're echoes, fragments of something older and darker than we can imagine. And now you're part of it." His words sent a chill through me, but before I could ask more, Elias fell silent, his eyes fixed on the tracks behind me. I turned to see what had caught his attention, and my heart nearly stopped. The fog was rolling in, thick and fast, swallowing the landscape in an impenetrable gray. From within it came the sound of metal groaning, the same low, resonant noise I'd heard in my dream. The ground trembled beneath my feet as the fog thickened, and then, through the haze, I saw it, the train. Its headlights flickered weakly, casting jagged beams of light that illuminated the platform in flashes. The train was just as I remembered, its rusted exterior and shattered windows exuding an aura of decay. Elias grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "You have a choice," he said, his voice urgent. "You can walk away now, leave the key, and never look back. Or you can board that train and face whatever waits for you." His words echoed in my mind as I stared at the train, its doors hissing open with an unnatural groan. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, their chorus rising from the fog and the shadows around us. "Come, find us, unlock the truth," they urged, pulling at me with a force I couldn't explain. My hands shook as I pulled the key from my pocket, its cold weight anchoring me to the moment. Elias shook his head, his expression one of pity and fear. "If you go," he said, "you might not come back. But if you do, you'll never be the same." The train's horn blared, a deep, mournful sound that reverberated through the air. The fog pressed closer, wrapping around me like a living thing. The key burned in my hand, its jagged edges digging into my skin as if urging me forward. My legs felt heavy, my breath shallow, but the pull was too strong to resist. With a final glance at Elias, whose face was etched with sorrow, I stepped onto the train. As the doors closed behind me with a deafening clang, the whispers ceased, replaced by an all-consuming silence. The train lurched forward, and the world outside the windows dissolved into shadows and light, a swirling void that defied logic. I clutched the key tightly, its cold bite the only reminder of reality, as I ventured deeper into the unknown, knowing that whatever awaited me on this journey would forever change the course of my life, and perhaps my soul. The train roared forward into the abyss, the windows revealing nothing but swirling shadows punctuated by fleeting flashes of pale light. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on unseen tracks. Each second felt like an eternity, my heart hammering in my chest as the icy key burned in my palm. I couldn't shake the feeling that the train itself was alive, the metallic groans and shifting walls breathing in sync with some sinister rhythm. The car I stood in began to change. The seats warped and twisted, the once rusted metal growing darker, slick with a substance that looked like oil but smelled faintly of decay. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me, dissipating quickly into the oppressive void. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I moved forward, each step carrying me closer to an unseen destination. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment, their words incomprehensible but dripping with malice. Ahead, a door appeared, framed by flickering light that seemed to bleed into the darkness. The key in my hand grew heavier, its edges biting into my palm, as though urging me toward the threshold. My breathing was shallow, each inhale feeling more labored as the train seemed to press in on me, its walls narrowing and pulsing like a living organism. When I reached the door, I hesitated, dread pooling in my stomach as I reached for the handle. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices warning, pleading, and taunting me all at once. I pushed the door open, and the world beyond was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The room was vast, far larger than the confines of the train could allow, its walls lined with shelves that stretched into infinity. Each shelf was packed with objects, rusted keys, faded photographs, cracked mirrors, and other items that seemed to pulse faintly with an eerie glow. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it lay a ledger, its pages yellowed and edges frayed. As I approached, the whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my very bones. The ledger was familiar. It was the same one I'd seen in my dream, its pages filled with names scrawled in trembling handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, the paper brittle beneath my fingers. Each page was filled with names and dates, alongside cryptic notes written in a language I couldn't understand. My stomach turned as I flipped through, recognizing names I'd read in the articles about Brackenridge Station. And then there it was, my name, written in bold, jagged letters. Beneath it was a symbol, the same one that had haunted my dreams, burned into mirrors and scratched into surfaces. Before I could process what I was seeing, the air in the room shifted. A chill ran down my spine as the shadows around me began to ripple, coalescing into a form that rose from the darkness like smoke taking shape. The veiled woman stood before me, her tattered gown flowing as if caught in an unseen wind. The rusted key she had held in my dream was now in my hand, its cold metal burning against my skin as her hollow eyes bored into me from behind the veil. Her voice was not a voice at all. It was a feeling, a resonance that echoed inside my mind. "You have come to know," she said, the words reverberating through me. "You hold the key, but do you hold the courage to open the door?" She gestured toward the far wall, where a massive, ornate door stood, its surface covered in the same symbols that had plagued me. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but no sound escaped my lips. My body felt frozen, my limbs heavy as if the air itself had turned to stone. The veiled woman stepped closer, and as she did, the shadows around her writhed, revealing faces. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, distorted, screaming, their hollow eyes filled with endless torment. "Each key holds a story," she said, her presence suffocating. "Each story has a price. What will yours be?" The door groaned, its surface pulsing with a dark, viscous energy that seemed to beckon me. My hands trembled as I raised the key, its jagged edges fitting perfectly into the lock. As I turned it, the room shuddered violently, the shelves collapsing, their contents spilling into the void. The shadows surged forward, their faces stretching and contorting as they surrounded me, their whispers now a deafening roar. When the door creaked open, what lay beyond defied comprehension. A swirling void of light and shadow stretched infinitely, filled with fragments of lives, echoes of screams, and the faint, agonizing hum of countless voices trapped in eternal despair. The veiled woman stepped closer, her hand reaching for mine. "Enter," she whispered, her voice now soft and almost tender. "Or turn back and carry the weight of what you've seen forever." The choice hung in the air, oppressive and final. If I entered, I would uncover the truth behind the station, the train, and the shadows, but at what cost? If I turned back, I would carry the burden of that key and the whispers forever, knowing they would never truly let me go. My breath caught as I felt the pull of the void, its darkness promising answers yet reeking of eternal loss. With one final trembling step, I made my choice. The veiled woman smiled beneath the shadow of her veil, a gesture both comforting and sinister. The void consumed me, and the world dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the whispers, their words now clear. "You belong to us now." When I woke, I wasn't in the void, or at least not entirely. My eyes fluttered open to the sterile, glaring lights of a hospital room. The hum of fluorescent bulbs buzzed above me, harsh and disorienting. My head throbbed, my body felt leaden, and the faint scent of antiseptic hung in the air. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was over, that I had escaped whatever nightmare had gripped me. But the second I moved, the weight of dread pressed down again. Something was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the rusted key on the bedside table. It sat there, impossibly clean against the pristine white sheets, its jagged edges gleaming faintly under the artificial light. My heart sank. No one could explain how it got there. Not the nurses, not the doctors who found me collapsed near Brackenridge Station. They asked questions, ones I couldn't answer. "How did you get there? What happened?" All I could do was stammer vague, fragmented responses. They didn't press further. Perhaps they saw the fear in my eyes, the haunted look I couldn't shake. When I was finally discharged, I returned home, but it didn't feel like home anymore. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper, the air colder. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a light, felt intentional, as though the house itself had begun to breathe. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, the aftermath of a traumatic experience. But the signs were impossible to ignore. The whispers began that night, soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. I dismissed them as tricks of my mind, remnants of the nightmare clinging to my psyche. But they grew louder, more distinct as the hours passed. The voices weren't random. They carried a message, repeating the same chilling phrase over and over. "It's not over." Then came the shadows. They moved where they shouldn't, defying logic and the light itself. In the corner of my eye, I'd see them stretch and writhe, their forms unnatural and shifting. Each time I turned to face them, they dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the faint impression of their presence, a lingering cold, a sense of being watched. The key began to reappear in impossible places. I'd lock it in a drawer, only to find it resting on my desk. I'd throw it into a box in the attic, only to discover it on the kitchen counter the next morning. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a reminder, a tether to whatever I had unleashed. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I saw it. The symbol, the same one from the ledger, burned faintly into the ceiling above me. Its lines seemed to glow with a faint, otherworldly light, pulsing like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a mark, it was alive, a presence that radiated malevolence. My chest tightened as the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with their overlapping voices. Desperate for answers, I returned to my research. I combed through every article, every archive, every scrap of information about Brackenridge Station. What I found only deepened the mystery. Stories of other survivors, if they could be called that, all shared similar tales. They spoke of the whispers, the shadows, the symbols. And they all ended the same way. The person vanished, leaving behind nothing but cryptic notes or recordings filled with frantic, incomprehensible warnings. The most chilling discovery came when I examined the symbol more closely. It wasn't just a mark, it was a map, a guide to something far older and darker than the station itself. Every line, every curve, seemed to pull my thoughts back to the void I had seen beyond the door, the swirling abyss filled with fragmented lives and endless screams. As the days turned to weeks, the divide between reality and nightmare blurred further. The symbol began to appear everywhere, in the condensation on my bathroom mirror, etched faintly into the frost on my windows, even burned into the wood of my desk. The whispers grew louder, their words clearer, as if the entities behind them were growing stronger. And then, one night, the veiled woman returned. She stood at the foot of my bed, her form as shadowy and flickering as before. The rusted key floated in her hand, glowing faintly in the darkness. She didn't speak aloud. Her voice was inside my mind, resonating with an unbearable weight. "You open the door," she said. "You cannot close it." Her presence lingered for what felt like hours, though it might have been mere seconds. When she finally dissolved into the shadows, the room felt emptier, colder, as though she had taken something vital with her. The key remained on the nightstand, its surface glistening with a faint, spectral light. Now I live in a state of constant unease. The whispers never stop, the shadows never rest, and the key never leaves. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know one thing for certain: it's not over. Was it all just a dream? Or was it the beginning of something far worse, something that has only begun to reveal itself? If you've ever felt the pull of a place you can't explain, or seen a shadow move where no shadow should be, you might already be closer to the truth than you realize. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with your theories, and share this story. Because the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than we think. And sometimes, when we open the wrong door, we might find something waiting on the other side, something that doesn't let go.